Welcome to another edition of Journey of Hope. Our special guests today are Tom and Vera Miller from Calamasa, California. 5 years ago in March, like any other day, Tom and his wife began the day with prayer. Tom and his son Nick went skiing up in Big Bear, just out of Loma here. And towards the end of the day, Tom and his son took two different routes. And Tom ended up going over fell 200 and some yards down a cliff and was unconscious. Tom and Vera, I want to welcome you to this journey of hope, and we want to learn a little bit about your background. And I know you've been have a very successful ministerial background, spent over 41 years working as a treasurer and as an auditor, and spent 11 years in Africa. And just after you spent your time in Africa, ended up coming here to the United States. And before we talk about your accident, I'd like to learn a little bit about your background. Where all did you serve? And then we want to look at a couple of pictures. But where did you begin your ministry?
I began my ministry in England, working for the British Union as a cashier. And after a couple of years there, I went to North England Conference as a secretary-treasurer, then the press, Stanborough Press, then back to North England Conference, and then I was called to the GC.
And you called to the General Conference, and what were you called there to do?
I was called there to be an associate auditor, associate director of the GC.
And then while you were there, you traveled apparently around the world?
Mainly around the United States, but I did go on overseas trips as well. And I worked there for 20 years, and then I had a call to go to Africa, which I initially was unwilling to do, but after a couple of days I went to Africa, planning on 4 years, but I had such a tremendous experience that I stayed there 11.
So you were there for 11 years. And Vera, how were you helping support Tom during his ministry at this time?
Yes, so actually I was teaching English as a second language, and I opened up a language school in Abidjan with a view to mission outreach.
Oh.
And eventually we developed a company there, and there's now a church there.
Oh, that's kind of exciting.
When we left, I handed it over to the mission, and so it's still going.
We got a couple of
actually.
pictures here we'll take a look at, and you can describe where they are, and it'll kind of give us a little insight. Go ahead and just talk to the pictures here.
Yeah, that's we were attending some meetings in Thailand with the GC auditing service, and we took the opportunity to go for a ride on an elephant. We also rode on a bullock cart and a raft, and overall I'm glad we have motor cars instead.
Okay, go ahead. We'll just kind of roll from one picture to the next here.
Okay, and that of course is Thailand as well, one of the temples there. This is a group of auditors in Africa, a group of my colleagues. We developed a very close working relationship. Initially when I went there, I couldn't understand them because of their accent, and they couldn't understand me. But after a while we developed an understanding and a good working relationship.
I can't imagine getting a large group of auditors together and all in one place at one time. What do we have here?
Well, we did some mission work in one of the villages, and this is a picture we took while we were working in the village.
Okay. And this is?
This is a group of African friends.
Over there, all right.
Over in Africa. Oh, this one was when I left Africa. And that's goodbye to the Miller family. They gave us a very warm farewell.
After 11 years, okay.
Yeah.
Then we got some family pictures here.
That's me with my mother and with my wife.
Okay.
And that's with my wife, my sister, and my brother-in-law.
Okay.
And that's at my daughter's graduation, wasn't it?
Son's wedding.
Oh, that was Nick's wedding. Yeah, that was Nick's wedding.
Okay, that's your son.
Yeah, that was my son and daughter. And again, this is the graduation with my daughter and my son.
Okay.
And Vera.
And then we have an accident.
Now, Lynn, this is a picture taken of me after I'd been cleaned up. I don't remember it being taken because I was unconscious at the time.
Well, I can't imagine how good looking you are there, and then to realize that they'd spent some time in cleaning you up. All right, tell us what happened. You begin, I'm sure there's many things that he doesn't even remember about that day, but knowing you and your family, you begin the day with prayer.
Yes.
Undoubtedly asking God to guide and direct and bless you and to watch over you.
Yes.
And many times we begin the day with prayer, but sometimes things don't work out the way we think they're going to. And so even after beginning the day with prayer and asking for guidance and direction and protection, you went skiing with Nick, had a good time during the daytime, and towards the end of the day, as I understand it, the two of you kind of separated and agreed to meet around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And somehow, nobody really knows everything that happened, but apparently, as I've listened to the story, you ended up going down a double black diamond and apparently went over a large a cliff or a group of rocks and went 200, 250 yards, fell down the mountain. Vera, you're probably going to have to fill us in a little bit, and Tom we'll kind of talk back and forth here, but what happened?
You're absolutely,
what do you think happened?
Lynn, you're right. I don't really know what happened. But somehow I fell 250 yards down the slope, scraping my face on the ground and hitting trees and rocks. I broke 7 ribs, 1 rib pierced my lung, and I wound up unconscious at the bottom. But I couldn't have been completely unconscious because I gave them the name of my son. But I was then airlifted to Loma University Hospital, the medical center, where I received excellent attention.
So you're one of our patients, and you came in by helicopter. And it's my understanding that you kind of decided to sleep for the next month and were kind of unconscious. So I'm going to have to let Vera tell the story. I mean, this must have been a frightening experience.
It was extremely frightening.
Who notified you?
Well, I was I was working at school preparing things for the next day, and
as a teacher.
Yes, speech therapist actually. Mm-hmm. But I received a phone call from my daughter, and she said, Dad's had an accident, but I don't think it's very serious. I think maybe he's broken his leg or something, and he's on his way to the hospital. And so I said, well, I'm coming home right away, and we'll go down to the hospital. So I left immediately, got home, and then when I opened the door, my daughter said, actually, it's worse because he's been air-vacced. I don't know what's happened. So we had no idea how bad it was, but the fact that he'd been air-vacced, we knew it was pretty serious.
So she was living here in the area at the time?
She was staying with us at the time,
And
right.
what kind of work was she doing?
She, at that time, I was trying to think, she was working at the jail. Yeah, she was working at the jail.
Working at the jail with
yes,
prisoners?
With prisoners, preparing them for...
So the two of you met, and then did you go to the hospital?
Right, we went to the hospital.
And eventually you got into the ICU or wherever
That's
he was,
right,
and
yes.
What did they tell you?
Well, they didn't tell us too much. They sort of said, well, it was serious, and they didn't really tell us too much. But my daughter-in-law was also visiting for the weekend from Michigan, and she's a physician, so she actually had gone there ahead of us and been there when the helicopter arrived. So that was very comforting because, she knew more of what was going on than we did.
Was able to kind of dialogue and understand
right.
some of the things
right.
that were taking place. So what kind of injuries did he sustain?
Well, as he said, he had a pneumothorax because he'd broken all these ribs, and then he had head injuries. And there we didn't know quite the extent of those at that time.
So he was taken care of. They immediately addressed some of the critical issues. And then apparently he was unconscious for nearly a month.
That's right.
And during this period of time, we know that he's just kind of resting and dreaming and thinking of all kinds of pleasantries. But what were you thinking? I mean, you had this very successful life as ministers, serving the Lord, and now, where's God in all of this?
Right. Well, we were very distressed, but we did have the Lord gives you encouragement. I remember early on, maybe it was the second day, we were at the hospital that night, and I went with my daughter and daughter-in-law, and we went down to the chapel at Loma Linda, and we prayed, And I remember my daughter praying a very special prayer. At that time, his oxygenation level was like 90%. And it's quite dangerous, I think, if this goes on for a prolonged period. And we were just hoping it would come down. So my daughter just prayed to the Lord. She prayed, Lord, please give us a sign, help his oxygenation, the level to come down. And we went back up to the ICU, and some friends were there. We visited with them, and then it was getting very, very late. It was like 12:30 at night. And my daughter-in-law said, before I leave, I'm going to check his levels again. And then she came back and she said, they've reduced 5%. And that was so encouraging, because that had been a specific prayer of my daughter's. And that really kept us going.
Kind of an encouraging.
Yes.
You kind of reached out in prayer and saw what you saw as a direct answer to that prayer. And yet we're still very early on.
Right.
I mean, this was just the first couple of days, apparently.
That's right.
And, God answers prayers in many different ways. And he's not always in a hurry.
That's right.
He always answers the right way at the right time. But this was just enough to give you an encouragement.
Absolutely.
Now, what happened after that? Because
well, there was another thing going on at the same time. We have friends, Pastor Charlie Watson, who many, many people know, and he had emailed literally around the world. He just knows so many people.
Informing about Tom's accident.
Yes, and asking for prayer.
So
and
people all around the world were praying for you, Tom.
Tremendous prayer support.
There's a favorite author of mine in a book called Great Controversy, 525, says that God is able to do that in answer to prayer, that which he could not do otherwise had we not prayed.
Right.
So people all around the world are praying.
Right.
Now, was there a dramatic improvement? I mean, people are praying, God's answering the prayer. Did he recover within 24, 48 hours, 72 hours?
Not at all.
Not at all?
No, it went on, and we would go in every day at the visiting times when we were allowed to go in, and we'd talk to him and try to get some response. And then after about 2 or 3 weeks, we felt had some response. We asked him to squeeze our hand.
But you're saying for 2, 3 weeks, there was really no
Right.
indication that he was
Right.
even hearing or processing, or
Right.
no way of no visible response. So you're continuing to pray, looking for some kind of a positive sign, and then what finally happened?
And then we did get a very slight response, and we knew it was. We all did. We told the doctors and nurses, and they didn't believe us because they didn't get it.
They've seen patients, and
Yeah.
they know that they know the relatives are hanging on to any little tiny thread, and whether it's real or imaginary, and they didn't want to disappoint you to say that it really wasn't what it was, but you saw and
Yes.
you knew.
Yes.
Now, what does this tell us about prayer and answered prayer and where God is in all of this, Tom?
It tells me, on looking back, that God always answers prayer, but not the way you want him to.
Not always the way you want him to.
Well, he's a God of absolute love and absolute wisdom, and he gives you the answer you need, and it's not always the answer you want.
Or when you want it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
His timing is always perfect, Lynn.
So he's unconscious for how long then?
Well, this was about 3 weeks, and then I don't know why I had never thought of it before, but I thought, well, why don't we ask for an anointing service? In James, it tells us that...
James 5, there's some
right,
specific...
James 5:14,
Yeah,
yes.
James 5:14. Very specific direction for the believer
Right.
to call people together to have prayer. So you, whose idea was this?
Well, it was mine,
It was
really,
your
yes,
idea?
Yes.
Okay, so what happened?
And so we did that.
You followed
And
the counsel.
That's right. And he made such remarkable progress after that. It was amazing. And he really did.
So you saw another turning
Yes,
point
yes.
during this period of time.
Yes.
So now, did the anointing take care of everything?
No, it didn't take care of everything.
Okay.
And in fact, around that time, I was just trying to think, I think it must have been just after that, we had a consult with a neuropsychologist in the hospital, and my daughter-in-law had to go back to Michigan that time, but she was on a conference telephone, and my daughter was there, and she discussed it with us, and she said that the brain damage had been a lot more extensive than we had imagined. It had gone right through the brain. And she said, he may have a complete personality change. She said that he probably will lose his mathematical ability. And we came out of there, and I turned to my daughter and I said, oh, that doesn't sound good. And my daughter, bless her, she said, Mum, she said, she didn't take divine intervention into account.
She's just talking about from her
That's
human
right.
standpoint,
That's right.
the prognosis may not, they're trying to prepare you
Yes.
for the worst. In
Right.
other words, he's maybe out of the woods, he's going to make it, but we really don't know how he's going to end up,
But if
how
you
he's going
can
to turn out.
believe this, we left that room, we went straight from that conference room to the ward, and as we walked in the door, Tom said Naomi, and that was the first time he'd spoken.
And Naomi was the daughter's name.
Yes, yes.
So right after this prayer,
Yes,
you
and
walked
this
in
conference.
after this conference,
Right.
and she said, they're not taking God's divine intervention.
Yes.
You walk into the room, and Tom says Naomi.
Yes, and I mean,
Wow.
that was just amazing. And then he turned to me and he said, I'm thirsty. Well, we couldn't give him water. So the nurse gave me a swab, and he took the swab and he sort of swallowed it, sucked it up and swallowed
So
it.
after sleeping for nearly a month, the first thing you say is your daughter's name, and I'm thirsty.
Well, I was unaware I'd been sleeping for a month. All I was aware is it was dark, and I heard this voice, and I recognized it, and I said, Naomi.
Okay, now, one of the encouraging things I learned about this as we were visiting is your daughter was working with these prisoners, and you told me something very special happened there.
Right. She was, she's usually very bright and cheerful, and she was sort of rather depressed, and they said, what's wrong? And so she told them about her father's accident, and they said, oh, we'll pray for him. And then she came back in, a couple of days later, and they said, we had 31 prisoners praying last night
So
for
prisoners were praying for you while you were in the hospital. Now, God gave you little signs along the way.
Yeah.
And you had the anointing. And then he gradually came out of it. Once you came out of it, you were there in the hospital for a month, and I understand you went over to the rehab, our East Campus, and the people there. How did they treat you over there?
Lynn, I don't remember.
Okay.
But I have recollections, and they are positive recollections. They looked after me well. I've got no complaints at all.
Okay, so the point I want to get at is after you were anointed, after there was a turning and a very positive indication that there was recovery, and then he begins to come out of it. We're still not sure what kind of a personality he's going to have. And I'm still not sure, as I know Tom here. The point I want to get is, even after God, you prayed and there was direct answer to prayer, there must have been some setbacks.
Well, even prior to that, they gave him, they gave him a test, and he could not name a table or a chair. So he was really aphasic when he first came around.
No recognition of any of
objects
this.
and be able to name
Okay,
them
so
and this
that
kind of
was
thing.
probably very frightening.
Oh, it really was, yes.
And then what happened? You told me about some of the other setbacks, and little by little he began to assimilate and be able to identify and
Right.
begin to speak, and it
Right.
began coming back. And of course, Tom, your memory of this is very, very limited.
Very limited.
But so tell me some of the other setbacks. He got through here, went over to East Campus, and finished over there for about a month. And
Right.
all the reports I heard is it was outstanding service. They had generally a compliant patient. Although you told me the story of one time when you became aware of the fact that you were in straps. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I woke up and I'd been tied down in the bed, strapped down, and I wondered why. And I thought, well, maybe it's to stop me falling out. I thought it can't be that because they've got the sides they can put up. So I wanted to go to the bathroom. I expelled the air from my lungs.
You let all your air out.
Yeah, let the air out so I could get out. Went to the bathroom, came back.
Got out from underneath the wraps.
Yes.
Escaped prisoner. Okay.
Came back and got underneath the straps again.
So you got back in bed, and
Got back in
they would
bed.
never know you'd gone anywhere.
Exactly.
Oh, Tom.
And then-
Only an auditor could do that.
But I asked them later, why was I tied down in bed? Because you've got sides. And they told me that I had become very unreasonable, very aggressive, and I was kicking people as they went by the bed.
Oh, my. So there was a lot of ups and downs
Right.
through this whole experience. Now, after he left the rehab, You told me that he went home and was kind of almost non-responsive, no initiative. Tell us what was happening there.
Yes, he would just sort of sit, and he wouldn't really talk. He might just reply and answer, but no initiation. And then also his legs became very swollen, and he began to have difficulty breathing when he went upstairs. So we sort of talked to the doctor about it, but they didn't really seem to think it was anything particularly serious. But then on the Sabbath afternoon, we went for a walk, and it was a total miracle. As we were walking, he became very, very breathless. So I knew there was a problem. So I said, "You wait here, and I'll go and get the car and bring you home." And he's, being what he is, and men what they are, no, I'm fine, And as we were discussing, it was just providential. This lady came out of her house, and she said, "Oh, do you have a problem?" So I said, "Yes," and I explained to her the situation. She said, "Oh, I'll go and get a chair and he can sit down." So of course he couldn't turn that off or down. So that really saved the whole situation. So then I went home and got the car.
And what did you find out was the problem?
And he had a pulmonary embolism.
Pulmonary embolism. My. So again, here we see, the Lord's taking you step by step. Not everything all works out just perfectly the way you think that it's going to, but the Lord's got his hand over you the whole time.
Absolutely.
But it didn't end with there. He had some other challenges.
Well, that's right. After the pulmonary embolism, they put him on Coumadin, and of course that is monitored very closely. And it came to the end of the week, and I guess they felt that it wasn't being effective enough, and they upped it. And I guess with the weakness in the brain from the brain damage, he had a cerebral hemorrhage. Well, the first I knew, I was actually over at school, and I called him, and he just began talking nonsense on the phone. I mean, total gibberish.
Tom,
and then began laughing.
Tom, I've known Tom.
So I rushed home, and when I got home, then he seemed sort of all right. So he wouldn't listen to going down to the hospital. "I'm fine, nothing wrong with me." So I had to get onto the phone to some doctors to persuade him to go to the hospital. And then I began to wonder whether, I'd have been imagining things. But as we were driving down the freeway and we turned off to go to Loma, he said, "Where are we going?" So I thought, oh, I was right. And then we went to the emergency room, but of course they did a CAT scan, and they found that he had got a cerebral bleed, but they couldn't do anything because they had to reverse the effects of the Coumadin before they could do surgery. So it took 12 hours, so we were sitting there, but in fact they did it a little early because he became so distressed and upset. And
well, it's an amazing journey that you've been on. Now, Tom, after you recovered, it's been a recovering process. You did go back to work, and you spent apparently two more years working. What were you doing?
I was in my old job as the associate director in the General Conference auditing service, and just doing auditing and traveling around and problem solving and so on.
So you spent an additional, so that made it almost 43 years.
43 years.
That you'd worked in the Lord's service,
Yeah.
and working around the world. So after this remarkable recovery, what are you going to do now?
That is an excellent question. I know many people have been through bad experiences, and it has not come out well. It has come out well for me, and what I have resolved, God has given me extra time, I'm going to use in His service. So I've attempted to be more active in my responsibilities at church and also in the community. So I'm serving the Lord.
You're serving the Lord. And what kind of capacity are you working now?
Well, I'm working with the Emerald Foundation, which supports the work in Ireland. I'm on the church board and the finance committee, on the academy board, the academy finance committee, and I'm also a commissioner on the library commission for the city.
Well, you're keeping actively involved in the community and in the church.
Right.
And you, as very few people realize, God's given you something special. He's had His hand over you. He led you through this journey. And if I'm hearing you correctly, you're determined that you're going to live your life to the fullest in a way that brings honor and glory to Him. Vera, what kind of a response do you have about what are you going to do with the future?
Oh, just before that,
Sure.
one thing I'd like to say is that with regard to the anointing service, I hadn't heard of too many of these happening these days. And I remember that when I went to the church, Tom at this point, he obviously was going to live, we didn't know what.
Sure.
And she said, Tom is being anointed. I thought you were only anointed when you were dying. And that sort of disturbed me. I thought, people don't realize. And I'm very happy, we had this wonderful outcome. And since in our church, we've had a number of anointing services with very, very good outcomes.
Oh, I'm so glad. Well, we've got about a minute left or so, a couple of moments here. I understand that you had a celebration in the Yucaipa church. Tell us, this was a year later after everything was, what happened then?
Well,
Kind of a point of celebration.
Yes, my daughter-in-law is a musician, and we had a beautiful celebration service of thanksgiving and praise, because we just know that the Lord did intervene, and we're so thankful. And I know there are times when, as you said, the Lord doesn't always give us the answers we want. And I just hope and pray that if I had been in that situation, that I would still have the faith that I have.
One really never knows. You'd like to think that you'd respond in a certain way, and sometimes some of our viewers, as they're watching, they went through a similar experience and they prayed, but it didn't turn out the way that it turned out for you. And I guess what kind of a word of encouragement would we have for them? Just that, God in His wisdom answers and kind of guides and directs and opens and closes doors.
That's right, and sees the end from the beginning. He
sees
the whole
end
picture
from the beginning, and we're very limited from our perspective.
And Lynn, His timing is perfect. The sun always rises on time, and the things happen to us on time.
The right time, on time, and it's always God's time.
That's right.
And that's important for us to remember. And He always chooses what's best for us. And He loves us anyway.
Well, I've been told I'm a walking miracle, and it's the doctors who've told me this, Lynn. There's one doctor in particular, he's asked me not to mention his name, and he says, give God the glory for everything that's happened to you.
Give God the glory.
Amen.